Chapter 4: Different Responses. The different responses given throughout history to the question of the relationship between faith and temporal realities, between the Church and the world, are still pertinent in one form or another. It is because they are germane to the ecclesial present, and not merely because of their historical interests, that we recall these points of view. The Christendom mentality. Christendom is not primarily a mental construct. It is above all a fact, indeed the longest historical experience the Church has had. Hence the deep impact it has made on its life and thought. In the Christendom mentality, and in the point of view which prolongs it, temporal realities lack autonomy. They are not regarded by the Church as having an authentic existence. It therefore uses them for its own ends. This is the sequel of the so-called political Augustinism. The plan for the kingdom of God has no room for a profane historical plan. The Church is regarded substantially as the exclusive depository of salvation. Outside the Church there is no salvation. Because of this exclusiveness, notwithstanding certain qualifications which do not change the overall picture, the Church feels justified in considering itself as the center of the economy of salvation, and therefore presenting itself as a powerful force in relation to the world. This power will spontaneously and inevitably seek to express itself in the political arena. Under these circumstances, participation in temporal tasks has a very precise meaning for the Christian. To work for the direct and immediate benefit of the Church. A historical example typical of this point of view is to be found in the well-known ban, non possumus, upon Italian Catholics, which prohibited them from participating until a few decades ago in the political life of their country. Christian politics, therefore, will mean assisting the Church in its evangelizing mission and safeguarding the Church's interests. This was the mentality which inspired the confessional parties in Europe and Latin America toward the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. This is the role which, in certain places, Catholics in public office are still expected to play. The interests of the ecclesiastical institution are represented especially by the bishops and the clergy. Laypersons, given their situation in political society, will normally act in an auxiliary capacity. The theological categories we have mentioned were formulated, at least essentially, in that era of history of the Christian community characterized by close unity between faith and social life. In our day, since this unity no longer exists, those categories have become dysfunctional and engender pastoral attitudes out of touch with reality. Worse yet, they engender conservative political positions tending towards the restoration of an obsolete social order or the shoring up of what is left of it. Let us not too easily dismiss this mentality as extinct. It survives today implicitly or explicitly in large and important sectors of the Church. It is the cause of conflict and resistance to change in the Church today which cannot otherwise be explained. The conciliar debates, and perhaps above all the post-conciliar era, provide sufficient proof of this. New Christendom. The grave problems facing the Church which arose from the new historical circumstances of the 16th century and were made more acute by the French Revolution slowly gave way to another pastoral approach and another theological mentality. Thanks to Jacques Maritain, this new approach was to be known as New Christendom. It attempted to learn from the separation between faith and social life, which had been so intimately linked during the era of Christendom. This attempt, however, was to use categories which were not able to shake off completely the traditional mentality, as we can see better with the help of hindsight. A century before, a similar effort had taken place, although it was perhaps less solid and coherent from a doctrinal point of view. We refer to the so-called Catholic liberalism, which sought to take into account the situation created a short time before by the ideas of French Revolution. Although it created a clamor, this movement was neutralized by the misunderstanding of the majority of the Christian community and the hostility of the ecclesiastical authorities. The theses of New Christendom mark another stage in the life of the Church. This is a first and well-structured effort, which attempts moreover to root itself in the traditional thought of the Church. If Augustinian theology predominated in the previous approach, Thomism does in the latter. St. Thomas Aquinas' teaching that grace does not suppress or replace nature, but rather perfects it, opened the door to possibilities of a more autonomous and disinterested political action. On this foundation, Maritain fashioned a political philosophy which also sought to integrate certain modern elements. The task of constructing the human city would consist above all in the search for a society based upon justice, respect for the rights of others, and human fellowship. Its meaning would not flow, as the approach we considered above, directly from religion or the defense of church interests. Consequently, the autonomy of the temporal sphere is asserted, especially in relation to the ecclesiastical hierarchy, thus preventing their later interference in an area considered outside their competence. The view of the Church as a power in relation to the world has been profoundly modified, but it continues to be, in a certain way, at the center of the work of salvation. A certain ecclesiastical narcissism is still evident. In fact, this approach seeks, by means of the creation of a just and democratic society, to achieve conditions favorable to the activity of the Church in the world. It is necessary to build a profane Christendom, in other words, a society inspired by Christian principles. Once the autonomy of the world is asserted, the laypersons acquire a proper function which was not recognized as theirs before. This function is facilitated by the famous distinction between acting as a Christian as such and acting as a Christian. In the first case, the Christians act as members of the Church, and their actions represent the ecclesial community. This is what happened with the leaders of Catholic action groups. In the second case, Christians act under the inspiration of Christian principles, but assume exclusive personal responsibility for their actions. This gives them greater freedom in their political commitments. Therefore, the special task of laypersons will be to create this new Christendom in the temporal sphere. To this end, they will find it useful to join organizations inspired by Christian principles and carrying a Christian name. This position represents an initial effort to evaluate temporal tasks with the eyes of faith as well as to situate better the Church in the modern world. This approach led many Christians to commit themselves authentically and generously to the construction of a just society. Those Christians who supported this position often had to endure the enmity of the faithful and church authorities, both of whom were of a conservative mentality. In fact, nevertheless, this approach amounted only to a timid and basically ambiguous attempt. It gave rise to fundamentally moderate political attitudes, at least in the beginning, which combined a certain nostalgia for the past, re-establishment of guilds, for example, with a modernizing mentality. It is a long way, therefore, from a desire to become oriented toward radically new social forms. The distinction of planes. The focus provided by New Christendom made possible an advance from the traditional viewpoint towards a position in which the terms of the church-world relationship are better defined. The first attempt to distinguish these two levels without separating them comes from Maritain. Later, the theme was quickly enriched and radicalized, losing every trace of Christendom. In the years prior to the Council, the pastoral and theological thinking of some sectors of the Church tended to draw a very clear distinction between the Church and the world, within the unity of God's plan. Much more clearly than in the past, the world emerged as autonomous, distinct from the Church, and having its own ends. The autonomy of the temporal sphere was asserted not only with regard to ecclesiastical authority, but also with regard to the Church's very mission. It was not to interfere, as institution, in temporal matters, except, according to the most venerable tradition, through moral teaching. In practice, this would mean, as we will see later, acting through the meditation of the conscience of the individual Christian. The building up of the earthly city, then, is an autonomous endeavor. As a result, the function of the Church in the world becomes clearer. The Church, it was said, has two missions: evangelization and the inspiration of the temporal sphere. By converting men to faith and baptizing them, wrote Conger, according to the mission she has received from the Lord, the Church presents and actualizes herself as the order apart of salvation and holiness in the world. By acting in the sphere of civilization, which means in the temporal order and in history, she fulfills her mission to be the soul of human society. The Church is not responsible for constructing the world, hence the lack of sympathy for this point of view from temporal institutions of Christian inspiration, especially those considered powerful. Institutions of this sort do in fact give the impression that Christianity is an ideology for the building up of the world. The planes are thus clearly differentiated. The kingdom of God provides the unity. The Church and the world, each in its own way, contribute to its edification. The functions of the clergy and the laity can be differentiated in like manner. The priest breaks off his point of insertion in the world. His mission is identified with that of the Church, to evangelize and to inspire the temporal order. To interfere directly in political action is to betray his function. Laypersons' position in the Church, on the other hand, does not require them to abandon their insertion in the world. It is their responsibility to build up both the Church and the world. In their temporal endeavors, laypersons will seek to create with others, Christian or not, a more just and more human society. They will be well aware that in so doing, they are ultimately building up a society in which man will be able to respond freely to the call of God. They will have, nevertheless, the fullest respect for the autonomy of temporal society. The mission of lay apostolic movements, on the other hand, should not go beyond the mission of the Church and the priest, to evangelize and to inspire the temporal order. To this theology corresponds a particular way of approaching the revision de vie technique, which assures an authentically Christian presence in the world. Christians meet, as Christians, only to share and celebrate their faith and to examine in the light of faith their own political options, or other options which might be different and even opposing. This theological perspective predominated in the specialized apostolic movements of Europe, the French in particular, around 1950 and a few years later in the Latin American movements. But in Latin America, contrary to the European experience, this approach did not extend beyond the members of the movements and certain pastoral circles. In practice, the greater part of the Church remained untouched by this church-world distinction, for it was contradicted by the strong bonds which consciously or unconsciously tied the Church to the existing social order. This model has the advantage of being clear and achieving a difficult balance between the unity of God's plan and the distinction between Church and world. By and large, this is the theological approach of many of the texts of Vatican II. There are, however, emphases and insights which go beyond this, for example in Gaudium et Spes. Conger explains that because this inductive method was used, Gaudium et Spes does not clearly distinguish between two missions of the Church. This relationship could have been stated from the beginning after the fashion of a doctrinal thesis, he said. But it is interesting to observe that due precisely to the dynamics of the inductive method, the constitution Lumen Gentium at times transcends a rigid distinction of planes.